Welcome to Griffy Lake Nature Day. We hope you're ready to watch and learn as we explore our local environments. Remember, you must follow along in your student journals and use the materials provided in your Nature Day activity kits to complete today's lesson.
Welcome to Fish Frenzy Station here at Griffy Lake. My name's Kate and I am one of the naturalists at Bloomington Parks and Recreation. Here at Fish Frenzy Station, we're going to be learning about food webs and food chains, some of our fish local here to Griffy Lake, as well as what adaptations those fish have to survive in Griffy Lake and other aquatic environments. So Griffy Lake is an aquatic habitat. Aquatic meaning based in water, and habitat meaning somewhere that an animal or an organism lives. Now there are four parts to a habitat. There's food, which we would get here maybe from some insects or some small fish or some plants. Water, which some animals might get from a drinking hole such as Griffy or from maybe their food that they're eating. Shelter. Here, a lot of our fish shelter in the shallow parts of the lake among some of the aquatic plants. And space. So right now, we have some of our fry fish in this little tank, but that's not a habitat for them. There's not enough space. Versus after this, when I put them back in the lake, they'll have plenty of space in their habitat. Let's go more into the food aspect, or more accurately, how the different animals interact in our Griffy Lake food chain. So there's a food chain and a food web. A food chain talks about who eats who, and in what order. So you go from your smallest, your producers that create that energy, such as your plants and things that can photosynthesize, take their energy from the sun, and you go all the way up to something that might eat things that eat other animals, such as our birds of prey in the area. Now, if from a food chain to a food web, gets a little bit more different. A food chain is pretty linear. It just goes in one straight line. But do you eat just the same thing all the time? Probably not. It's the same thing with a lot of our animals. You're not just eating one thing down below you, you're eating a bunch of different stuff. Sometimes your food might eat some of your other food. A food web shows how the energy moves within Griffy Lake a little bit better than a food chain does. Because in a food web, instead of just one line, it can go out like a spider web with birds eating different things and things coming back to be decomposed. It shows a more complete picture of energy movement. So if we look at just a short snippet of the food chain of Griffy Lake, you can get a glimpse of what it might look like. As we follow along with the food chain and some of the other questions about how our food chain interacts, you should be in your journal on the Fish Frenzy pages. You can add arrows to that diagram of our food chain, and then on the next page you can look at some of our questions we might have regarding our food chain. Here we have a small drawing of what a piece of the Griffy Lake food chain might look like, looking at four different things that call Griffy Lake home. Let's start from the bottom. The first thing we have that puts energy into a system, what you use to run around and do things in your life, is the sun. The sun is our main source of energy. Now, the first living thing in our food chain is phytoplankton. If you do Aquatic Odyssey, you'll learn about phytoplankton and zooplankton. Plankton is a tiny little organism that floats around and lives in our lake and other bodies of water. Phyto means light. A phytoplankton is kind of like a very tiny plant. It uses light as its source of energy, so it makes energy from that sunlight. Now, Next up is zooplankton. Zooplankton is a different kind of plankton, and instead of being from light, it's from zoo. So think of zoo as in it's an animal plankton. Zooplankton eats phytoplankton. So these tiny little animals eat the tiny little plants. Next up in our food chain is our bluegill. Bluegill is one of our fish that is stocked here at Griffy Lake. It's our medium-sized fish, and some people do fish for it to bring it home and eat. But the bluegill eat the zooplankton. Next up is the top of our food chain, the largemouth bass. Largemouth bass is another fish that's stocked here at Griffy Lake, and it often eats the smaller bluegill. Now, this isn't what they only eat, but it is a large portion of it, so we're going to focus on this. Now, when we talked about our resources, our 4 parts of our habitat, we talked about food, water, shelter, and space. Now, if we look at our food chain, things at the top of the food chain are going to need more resources than things at the bottom. For example, the phytoplankton really only needs the sunlight to make its energy. However, the largemouth bass needs bluegill, which needs zooplankton, which needs phytoplankton. So the largemouth bass will take more resources to have a population of them. A food chain is similar to a chain in everyday life, in that it only works if all of its links are a part of it. For instance, if I take away zooplankton, what do you think would happen to the bluegill? The bluegill doesn't have any more food, so the bluegill would eventually starve and die off, and then that would affect the next one after it, the largemouth bass, which would eventually die off as well. Now, it's easy to see what happens to what would be eating after we take the part out of the food chain. However, what do you think would happen if, when I put this back in, and instead of zooplankton, I take away our top predator, the largemouth bass. Now, there's nothing after the largemouth bass, so would taking away our top predator hurt the food chain? It would, because the largemouth bass eats the bluegill. So, if the bluegill no longer has a predator, there's going to be a lot more bluegill. And those bluegill could then eat a lot more zooplankton, which could then cause the zooplankton to die off. So it's not just the beginning or the middle, but also the end of our food chain that is very important. Our top predators have a big impact on our environment. So we've discussed the parts of the habitat, specifically going into our aquatic habitats, and we've talked about our food chains and food webs. We're going to transition to talking about our fish and their adaptations. We talked about how they eat and how they move in our food chain, and we talked about how they make the aquatic environment of Griffy their home. But how do they survive in that home, in that habitat? Let's break it down. So first we have our general fish body. Now, sometimes we can have our wider fish like our bluegill, or our more cylindrical fish like our largemouth bass and our catfish. But either way, they still function well in the water. So the things that give our fish its fish look are all of our fins, which are used for maneuvering and stability. There are 5 different types of fins that we'll go over. We have the pectoral and the caudal, otherwise known as the tail fin. These help with the maneuvering, moving the fish from place to place. The pelvic, anal, and dorsal fins are on the top and bottom of the fish. This helps keep the fish vertical in the water and prevents it from tumbling over. So that is where it gets its stability from. The next thing on our fish is how it survives in the water. We as people use our lungs to breathe air, but the fish use their gills to extract oxygen from the water. These gills are slits just above the pectoral fin of the fish that allows water to pass through the fish's mouth and out its gills so that it can extract that oxygen. The next part of our fish are the scales. These overlapping little scales help protect the rest of the fish's skin from harm. A fun fact about the scales is that with each year of growth, another layer comes onto the scales in a little bit like tree rings, so that if you catch a fish and look at the scale, you can count the rings and see how old it was. The next adaptation that some of our fish have is whisker-like projections from their face called barbels. The barbels help the fish to taste and smell what's around it. What I always think about with barbels is our catfish. Now, the catfish live on the bottom of our lake, which means it can be a little bit silty and muddy and hard to see things. So, the catfish rely on their barbels to smell and taste their way to their food. Another way that fish can find their food or escape from predators when they are in murkier waters and can't see as well is to use their lateral line, which is referred to as kind of a sixth sense. The lateral line, lateral meaning long ways, goes across the body of the fish. And this line helps detect vibrations in the water. That way, if they can feel and sense something moving nearby, they're able to either grab it if it's food or swim away if it's a predator. Now, while they can use all of these different adaptations to stay alive through finding prey or dealing with predators, fish still have pretty good eyesight, and they can see a lot of what's going on around them. But when it's murkier water, when the silt's been disturbed, it's very helpful to them to have all of their other senses to help them survive. At this point in your lesson, you should have all of your journal pages filled out and be ready to start on some of our activities with your class.
Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.